How many of y'all are actually involved in the industrial real estate sales development aspect of the business? Hands up. Okay, so we have some folks that work in the business. How many of y'all that had your hands up in the last 2 years have been to a container port on the waterfront in the U.S. somewhere? Hands up. A couple of you. How many of y'all have been to a railroad terminal where containers are handled in the last couple of years? One hand, two hands. If you're in the industrial business, if you're in the industrial sector, you have to continue to pay attention to what's going on with the infrastructure that supports global trade. So congratulations to you who have had those port tours and those intermodal tours. It's an aspect of business that's really, really critical in terms of keeping track of the goods flow. The conversation that I've been assigned to present today is about trends in distribution and logistics, but more than that, I want to try to talk about how it affects industrial real estate. Because it doesn't make any sense to sort through the global piece of how sourcing is changing and where transportation infrastructure is changing and what that means until you bring it back into the context of what it really does to the demand for real estate, for industrial, for vertical, somewhere in the marketplace. Can you dial the... I'm getting a lot of feedback up here. Can you dial it back a little? Or can you hear back there? Let me just introduce our firm for a minute because it sets the context for the conversation. We've been in the foreign trade zone development business for over 30 years. And the foreign trade zone business has been an aspect of business that allows importers primarily to benefit their cash flow as well as manage duties and taxes. And out of that relationship with people who develop buildings, we have over the last 10 years had relationships with real estate investment trusts and large developers who said, if a foreign trade zone was so valuable to a site, tell us where the logistics business is changing the demands for industrial development. Where and how are changes in infrastructure, changing in sourcing, supply chain reconfigurations, how do those affect real estate and where should we be? And so we began this voyage with the developers to show them how logistics, how sourcing, how shipping affects real estate. We also work in the supply chain security business. It's not a really salient point to today's conversation, so I'm going to pass it through. I also disclaim my conversations when I have these presentations. The first one is that when you hit the save button on your presentation, and you guys wanted this PowerPoint a couple weeks ago, something changes. Something is different. Something has occurred that is affecting where we are in the marketplace. As an example of that, on Tuesday of this week, for the fourth time now in the last 8 months, the Department of Transportation has decided to not enforce the new hours of service regulations that are part of what they're promulgating under what they consider to be the FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Now, driver's hours of service doesn't seem like a really big deal to an industrial developer or to somebody who's in the building business. But if you're the guy who has to operate the logistics system out of that building, and your drivers now can only run 13 hours instead of 14 hours, or they can only recruit 34 hours instead of 60 or 70 hours in a certain cycle time, that certainly has an effect on the way you're going to need to think about deploying your distribution. You're inbound from the port to your warehouse or to your facility, and you're outbound from the warehouse to the stores or to the retail centers that you support. And if in fact they're going to change that, then it requires that you look at your network of facilities, requires that you look at how you manage the outbound transportation, inbound transportation to your stores, and adjust that. Well, these movements down the road, this effort of kicking the can down the road in Washington speak, has a direct effect on people's decisions about what they're going to do with where and why they build and where and why they react to the demands of consumers as they themselves move around. So the conversation today is going to be about logistics and the evolving supply chains in Panama. There's a lot of interest and a lot of noise about Panama. We'll talk a little bit about that and the Suez Canal, because the Suez Canal is already affecting the east coast of the United States, and the ports on the east coast have, I believe the count is 16 strings of ships now that arrive on and call on ports on the east coast through the Suez Canal. Significant shift from just a few years ago. Look at the inland ports and some of the implications of inland ports. There's been some noise about inland ports here in Florida. 2 or 3 of them with potential. It was over 6 years ago that I made the first trip to Central Florida, to Lakeland and Winter Haven, to look at the property that CSX had planned for activity there. And they're finally starting to get some traction in that regard. We want to look at some of the growth markets in the U.S. The question was asked this morning, where is the growth? Well, to the extent that I can do that, I want to answer that question with respect to the industrial real estate. And then obviously the force of e-commerce, even though it's a small portion of the overall retail, there's certainly some shifts there that you as an industrial developer or in that space need to pay attention to, because it's going to change the way people look at their warehouses, people manage their warehouses, people configure the inside of their warehouses, and most likely, actually, will change where those warehouses need to be located as well in order to support e-commerce as it continues on the growth pattern that it's on. So what are the things that are real about an international supply chain? We have seen since the 1980s in the United States that we have sought for manufacturing centers in lower cost labor centers. And I lived in McAllen, Texas, which is about as far as you can go in South Texas during the 1980s, and I could actually hear that sucking sound that Ross Perot described when he was running for president about the jobs leaving the U.S. and going to Mexico. Policy-wise, that's another conversation, but in reality, that's been what has occurred in terms of manufacturing, looking for lower-cost labor. Well, that does 2 things. It extends the supply chain, and it creates predictability as well, predictability issues in the supply chain. And what does that mean? The further I go into a remote production center, the longer my supply chain is, and the more potentials there are for disruption in that supply chain. Now, to the guy who runs the building, it's no big deal, but to the guy inside who runs the inventory, he needs to be able to know when his shipments are going to arrive. He can deploy that inventory and he can push it out to his retail. In reality, what these remote supply chain or these remote supply centers do is it pushes more goods into the inventory supply chain, and it creates demand for more distribution. In the 1980s and 1990s, we created a new word called a maquiladora. And a maquiladora was one of those plants in the United States and across the river in Mexico where a day's production would go across the river and it would come back. And we accessed lower cost labor in that regard. In the 1990s, late 90s, and 2000, we started to look at coastal China, and I'll show you that graphic in a minute. And we've moved toward using that as a source for low-cost labor. And in today's environment, I'm watching ships now come from India, from Vietnam, and even some of the people that I'm talking to are sourcing in Africa specifically. So let me show you the anatomy of a supply chain, and I'm not going to go into the details. I have my timer here, and I'm going to make sure I get through so you guys can finish up. But there's 6 steps on this page about a supply chain. And if I turn the page, I get to 11 steps. Those are 11 custody transfers between the point of origin at the factory in a remote part of the world and the arrival of goods at a distribution center. Now, that's only half the supply chain, because you still have to get the goods out of the warehouse into the retail center or into the consumer's hands, and that adds another complexity and another layer of custody into that process. Now, there's 4 channels of custody in a supply chain. I'll talk to them only because I want to make sure that we're thorough in understanding how a supply chain operates. It's the physical movement of the good. These 11 steps are the physical movements of the goods from the factory to the distribution center. Somebody controls that. Those 11 people are controlled by somebody. The beneficial cargo owner themselves, that's the BCO, that's a logistics word you need to learn. The actual 3PL or a third party who's hired by the BCO to manage the goods in transit. And they relate to the buyer and the seller based around a set of terms called INCO, International Commerce Terms, which define who has the responsibility for the transportation cost as well as the transportation risk for the insurance of the goods that move. Then there's also the aspect of information that's related to the supply chain movement. That is customs and bills of ladings and booking information. And all those things have to be coordinated so that there aren't any disruptions in the supply chain. The final one is the financial, the letters of credit, the payment for vendors. Those 4 channels of custody are critical for these 11 steps to function and to function well. I have to start with the fundamentals. The TEU, the 20-foot equivalent unit, is sort of the foundation on which we've built our transportation system on a global basis in the last 20 years, probably 30 years. I think Malcolm McLean started in '62, if my memory serves me. It's this box that, when you follow it to its destination, defines the answer to the question this morning: where is the demand for space? And if you follow the container, we ask a rather less eloquent question: where does the box stop? And so the question for you guys when you talk to your port directors and your port managers and your intermodal terminal managers is, you're unloading 1 million, 1.5 million TEUs in a Savannah or in a Charleston or New York, a little fewer than that in some of the Florida ports. Where are those boxes actually going? Some of them stay locally because the goods are consumed locally. Some of them are transloaded. That means they come out of the container, the ocean container, and they go into a truck and they move inland, and it's almost impossible to see the visibility in the supply chain from there forward. And then some of them get on a train, and that's an important piece. I'll show you why in a minute. Some of them get on a train and go inland, and they go 250 miles, 300 miles, 400 miles. Coming off the West Coast, they travel 1,600 miles to get to the load centers in Chicago, and even in some cases all the way across to New York and New Jersey. But the TEU is the measure through which all capacity is confirmed. So we look at a port like this, and there's thousands of these things on the ground, and you know, the dwell time between the time they arrive at the gate and they leave is a critical component of creating that predictability. It's the same on the West Coast as they discharge from the ship to get into the terminal and then back out of the terminal onto the rail or onto the truck. Those are important pieces of the supply chain. Now, why is this important to the industrial community? When we were running at 6 and 8% of import growth prior to 2008, we had a formula that was fairly productive. And that is that 20,000 TEUs, 20,000 of those boxes, delivered 1 million square feet of demand somewhere forward of that port of arrival. Now, obviously, shoes and bicycles take up a different demand space, but you can use that as, in Texas, we call it a swag. I'll leave out the definition, but you guys, it's a sophisticated guess. But 1 million square feet is the derivative of 20,000 TEUs as it crosses a dock. And in that 1 million square feet, typically in a warehouse that supports imports, there's 200 to 300 jobs. So the story for the economic developers is, and the jobs creators is, we need to understand how much of those goods is ending up in our community. That's where the demand is. In an e-commerce container or in an e-commerce warehouse, significantly higher job creation than the typical pure import warehouse. Big ships, we move goods from the ship to the rail to the truck. We never unload the goods. That's why it's called intermodal. We move between the modes fluidly in order to get the boxes off the ship onto the rail, onto the truck, and inland to the consumer. In 2011, we made 11 on an intermodal rail alone. That is, the railroads moving boxes. We moved 11.9 moves, and that's up almost 6% from 2010. And 20% over 2009. So we've seen some real good solid growth on the rail side of the intermodal movement. The challenge, obviously, for many of the BCOs and their importers and their 3PLs is fixing the challenge of fuel pricing. And where will it go? And that's why we believe we've seen so much of a shift toward rail and toward rail intermodal. There's two categories of freight. The greatest example of discretionary freight is a 1 million square foot warehouse outside of Norfolk. The company operates that, and over the course of the year, you watch that warehouse, and containers pull up to it starting in about March and April and May and June. And these are all inbound containers coming from their low-cost suppliers. And by July and August, that million-square-foot box is chock-a-block full of Christmas stuff. Because they're smart enough to figure out that if they buy their goods from the offshore sources off-cycle, starting in January and February, they can reduce the labor even more. They can take advantage of the lowest cost transportation cycles, because during that period of time, transportation costs are compressed significantly from what they are during the peak season for the 4 or 5 months before we get into the Christmas build-out. So discretionary freight is that piece of the supply chain that always looks for the lowest cost end-to-end between an origin and a destination. It has very little sensitivity over time. Where obviously the time sensitive, the automotive, is looking for very, very stable, very predictable activities between origin and destination. Why is that thing doing that? Here's an interesting conversation starter about what's going on in China as we look at their capacity. China's labor has primarily been coastal for the last 10 years. That is, most of it has been near 300 or 400 miles away from the large major coastal ports. And what China has established as a strategy for themselves is to move their rail network inland and create inland ports where they can access even the next layer of lower cost labor, in order to maintain competitiveness with the Vietnams and Indias and Africas. But more than that, what those new inland intermodal terminals will give to China is in the future a place where they can manufacture goods not only for export, but also for consumption. So those will become distribution center points for them as well. So China still has a long way to go. You pull it? Okay. So China's not done being a serious player in terms of their access to and the availability of lower cost labor. But those terminals, as they go live, become sources for export, for import, and for warehousing and distribution. In Mexico, we've seen a great deal of press about the problems and the challenges and the things that are not working well in Mexico, but in the midst of all that, there's still been a resurgence in foreign direct investment in Mexico. And manufacturing in Mexico is not gone. Manufacturing in Mexico is in fact resurging. We've had 75 FDI projects come into Mexico in the last year. Mexico is the third in the globe in light manufacturing in terms of its contribution to manufacturing. It's the 10th in heavy manufacturing. And here's a statistic that ought to really rock you, especially as a university. Mexico has 451,000 students enrolled in advanced engineering degrees today. In the United States, we have 370,000 students enrolled in advanced engineering degrees. That's a Bloomberg statistic, not mine. So they're setting the table to maintain that edge in manufacturing, that edge in global competitiveness down there. And you can see that in the press almost every day. Nissan just announced a couple $2 billion worth of investment in Mexico. In July of last year, I'll tell you this story only because Florida's a fairly open state in terms of labor. 2 weeks after Volkswagen announced Volkswagen opened their new plant in Chattanooga, Audi made an announcement that they were going to look for a site in the United States to produce their SUVs, very much like what's going on in Spartanburg with BMW. A week after that, Bob King made an announcement that he was going to target Volkswagen as a prospect for adding them to the union rolls. And another week later, Audi made an announcement that they were going to expand their site search for their manufacturing center to include locations in Mexico and Canada. And in that 2-3 press release activity, 6,000 jobs left the United States. Boom, just like that. That sort of thing we have to find a way to solve. Just move it, there we go. All right, so the supply chain itself, we've had a lot of challenges over the last years. Typically, and I'll show you the graphics of this in just a second. We were West Coast centric in our trade, but in 2002 we had a fairly significant shift on the West Coast, and that is the labor disruption, where hundreds and hundreds of ships were out in the water. And I can tell you today the direct result of that is 2 million square feet of warehouse space for a little company called Walmart in Houston, and another couple million square feet of warehouse space for that same little company along the East Coast, because they said we're never ever going to be held hostage at one port. We have to have that flexibility in our supply chain that allows us to choose the ports, use the ports where we get the best predictability and the best sourcing, and move our freight through those conduits. And the result of that has been direct implications for East Coast ports, and the noise in the press is relentless about the Eastern Coast ports trying to find their way to be ready for the opportunities that will exist in 2014. Slow steaming is one of those interesting processes. During the lowest part of the recession and the drop in global trade, rather than allow the steamships or the ships to set up in the water and not be used, they just slowed them all down. So now instead of using 12 ships on a rotation between China and the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal and the East Coast, now they're using 14 or 16 ships, but they're going slower. And the net result is, hey, what? More inventory in the pipeline, more stuff that has to be looked at in terms of cost for the BCO or the user. We've got port labor issues. I'm going to move through these. But one of the critical things that's happening around the U.S. right now is that we're seeing exports driving port growth. And I'll show you the graphic on that in just a minute. So the West Coast was originally sort of the gateway to the U.S. over the years. Up until 2002, that was almost all the freight that came to the U.S. came through L.A. and Long Beach. There was very, very little that moved around in other ports. Things moved a little slow, but we did discover that we could put freight through the Panama Canal up to the East Coast, and then from China again to multiple ports on the West Coast, as far south as Lázaro Cárdenas, which is an active port in Mexico, and up at Prince Rupert. And while my geography doesn't reflect it, it's actually 2 days closer to steam from China to Prince Rupert than it is to steam to the LA and Long Beach complex, which means if there's an efficient transfer of goods at Prince Rupert to the railroad, I can get to Chicago as much as 2 days earlier by going that route than I can by coming across the West Coast. So those increments for the right kind of freight make a big difference. Then I've got the Suez Canal to the East Coast. And this is a rather busy slide, and incidentally, I've got a copy of this presentation for all of y'all who want one. I brought a stack of CDs, so you're welcome to grab one when you go. This is a really busy slide, and basically what it shows is the disparity between the East and West Coast, both from a cost standpoint and from a traffic standpoint. And this shows some of the different challenges that we have in terms of imports and exports as they arrive and depart some of the inland locations. And clearly, the destination for imports is significantly different than the origin for the exports as they leave the country. This is a description of the loaded TEU statistics for the major ports in the country. And you can see that the very, very shallow growth, a few positives, a few negatives, but overall very, very small. And when you look at GDP, historically we always saw trade growing at about a 2 times factor to GDP. With 1.7 GDP, I believe was the number last year. It's not an increment for significant growth, where some of these numbers 5, 6 years ago, you could really look at them and say there's 7, 8, 10% growth on some of the key markets. Again, if you go back to my original conversation about 20,000 TEUs drives 1 million square foot of warehouse space, you can see that where there's real growth opportunities, at locations like Savannah, where they've had 5% growth, there's significant opportunity there. The challenge is how much of that freight stays local in Savannah versus what goes inland to Atlanta and even beyond. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but it shows both imports and exports. And again, it's a function of looking at the differences between the import and the export business. The import business, it was real easy to predict the relationship between TEUs and demand. On the exports, they come from different locations, they come from different origins in the country, they are trucked from far greater distances, and they come from places where the containers aren't necessarily available around an intermodal terminal. And so it's really created a strain for the ocean carriers to try to marry up their origin and destinations with where the freight arrives and departs from a demand for exports. Comment or two about what's going on here in Florida. Tampa has some work being done with railroad enhancements on the dock, which will give them an opportunity to participate. However, there are some challenges there with respect to water depth. Jacksonville, there's a place called Mile Point, if I recall right, where there's some channel obstructions that have to be fixed in order to solve some water depth problems. And while Miami is going to probably spend $1.5 billion to get to a 50-foot water depth, there still has to be a way to get the freight off the Miami terminal in order to get it inland if Miami's going to be the first call around the Horn. And now you have to get into the mind of the steamship line and look at the geography of moving from China around the Panama Canal to the U.S. coast or the U.S. East Coast. And is the demand to stop first as far north and then move back down the East Coast and go to Miami because it's got the deepest water as an exit point where I can load my exports and go home or back around the cycle? Or do I stop at Miami and unload because it's got the deep water and then go to the other ports that have less capacity? That's a steamship line operation, that's a demand operation. The carriers say they go where the BCOs want them to go, but in reality they're going to go where they can make money, and I'll show you in a minute how much difference it is between the big ships and the medium and the small ships in terms of the value to the operator relative to moving and using the bigger ships. So the Panama Canal, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's a 108-foot wide ship and a 110-foot slip. That's why we need a bigger canal, because the biggest ship that can go through there today in terms of capacity is about a 4,500 TEU ship. When we're done with it, they'll be able to move 12,500 TEU ships through the canal. Significant new capacity. Now, the problem is in the last 4 or 5 years since they decided to design and build this thing, that we have ships around 18,000 that are on the marketplace and are being built and are fixing to be delivered. 18,500 TEUs. That's a lot of boxes to unload at a major port. Will we ever see one of those in the U.S.? Maybe in LA, maybe in 5 to 10 years, but probably not on the East Coast. Maybe not even the 12,000 TEU ships on the East Coast for a number of years, for a number of reasons. The Suez Canal has lots of water depth. No restrictions. It can handle the large ships today. There are some security issues that have to be addressed, and I'm doing okay on time. One of the things that's interesting is that if you didn't pay attention into your geography class, the distance from Hong Kong to the East Coast is not really very much between the Suez Canal route and the Panama Canal route. So there's a lot of flexibility that's provided to the ocean carrier as they deploy their strategy. A lot of that's based around the sourcing, because coming through the Suez Canal, I can stop in other ports and offload and upload other cargo from markets that I can't get if I go through the Panama. So the evolution of the ships looks like this, and that's really not in line anymore, because there's one more category to the right there of the 18,000 TEU ships. Today in Charleston on high tide, you can actually unload or load out a 9,000 TEU vessel and float it out onto the channel and go forward. can't do that in very many other places on the East Coast. And you can only do it in Charleston when it's on a high tide, and you've loaded that ship as down to the water line and loaded with exports and leaving the U.S. This is an interesting little graphic about the difference in the capacity between the ship's sizes and the value per container. Now, if you're the ocean carrier, and you look at this and say I can make $150 a box by using the bigger ship over an 8,000, or I can make $250 a box by using the big ship over a 6,000 TEU ship, I'm going to go with the bigger ship. It's just not even hard to figure out. The problem is that I've got to sort out where I'm going to deploy that ship, and I've got to figure out how many places that can accept that size ship. And that becomes a real issue for us. I'll show you why here in a second. This is a picture of a 12,000 TEU ship. And if you count across the top of that, I believe there's 23 containers that are part of that load. Now, one of the problems that most of the ports on the East Coast and the West Coast have is that the cranes that are required to drop down and reach out 23 wide require a whole new building of piers and wharves, and the rail lines that support the cranes. So a lot of folks are going to have to spend not only money to dredge and get the deep water, but they're going to have to retrofit some of their cranes and wharves to accommodate the biggest ships. And once you've unloaded those ships, now you have a problem because there needs to be a balance. And this is important for you to understand relative to where the demand is going to go in the terminals. The water side capacity, the terminal capacity inside the fence, that's the wharf and the loading and the truck gates and all the logistics things that go on inside the terminal, and the land side, that's the place outside the fence. Their capacities have to match. And if you look at ships this size coming into the port, and you're going to discharge what used to be 1,000 TEUs off a 4,000 or 5,000 TEU ship, and you look at a container like this, and now I'm going to discharge 3,000 or 4,000 containers, I've got to have a way to deal with that. I mean, this is very much the story of the snake that crawled into the chicken house and could get in through the door, but after he ate an egg or two, he couldn't get back out. Well, that same picture is of what the ports have to do trying to push freight through a network that's designed for a far smaller system. The problem is that the ports don't control what's outside the fence. That's in the private sector, in the public sector. And so the road building and the capacity and the railroad activity has to be done through collaboration. I'm okay on time. Here's an interesting chart of where the vessel capacity is on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And the highlights are places where there's yeses, buts. The yeses, buts are pretty critical. Air draft, that's how high you can go under the big bridges. In New York, that's a critical problem. So not only do they have to spend money to dig out underneath the water, but now they have to lift up the Bayonne Bridge in order to get the big ships underneath the bridge. Turning basins are a problem. Draft restrictions in a number of ports, including Houston, where I live. What's interesting is that there's a move afoot to take advantage of a Gulf rotation, a Gulf Coast rotation that would include a Tampa or possibly Manatee if we can get some more capacity there, a Mobile because of the automotive sector, and Houston because of the logistics of the oil field, and it's a great export port. And a Gulf rotation would preclude the need for a carrier coming around the Panama Canal to go up to the East Coast and then back around Florida to get into the Gulf. If you just did that rotation alone and there was enough volume there, you could have a great story to tell in Florida, a great story to tell in Mobile, and a great story to tell in Texas, because now those markets become the gateway through which freight can move inland rather than just pure East Coast moving inland. A couple of comments about inland ports. Now, this is the answer to the question, where do the boxes stop? Traditionally, we've moved freight off the West Coast to Dallas-Fort Worth, to Chicago, and to Kansas City. I'll show you a picture of several of those terminals. We also have the northern routes in Seattle and Tacoma. Those destinations, however, end up being very much the same. Dallas, Kansas City, Chicago. And then our friends at Prince Rupert, that's new to the program, but very, very effective. When a little company like FedEx says we route most of our Midwest cargo, and another little company called Home Depot says we route most of our Midwest cargo over Prince Rupert into Chicago, I pay attention. That's a huge shift away from the West Coast. Another one there from Rupert, then, can't see this, what's it doing? All right, here we go. Some East Coast ports start to come into the equation. Lázaro Cárdenas comes into Houston and to Atlanta on the Kansas City Southern Railroad, Houston and Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, and there should be a Jacksonville turn here. There we go, Jacksonville, Miami as well. All those routes are port to inland port destinations. And if you look at that set of inland port destinations and you overlay that with a population and a population migration, you have a pretty compelling story as to where those demand points are going to be. A little bit on the rail providers. We have 6 Class 1 railroads. I take that back. 6 Class 1 railroads in the States. 2 of them primarily Western railroads, the BN and the UP. CSX and Norfolk Southern operate primarily on the East Coast. Kansas City Southern is more of a north-south. You guys are blessed here to have a very strong partner with FEC as well. And then we have the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railroads, and they all have sort of their own geography. And one of the interesting things that's going on in this space today is that if you look at a BN or UP rail long haul coming across to Chicago, rather than transfer power and rather than move those boxes from the railroad to one rail terminal to another rail terminal, there's agreements between the carriers now where one crew steps off and one crew steps on, and that train just keeps going. And the best example of that is a refrigerated unit train that runs from Delano, California, that's just north of Bakersfield, to Schenectady, New York, with about 30 rail cars of frozen goods, and they're cutting that across the country in 4.5 to 5 days. That's remarkable transportation service in that environment. But these are the battleground locations. This sort of sweet spot in the population from Chicago to Harrisburg to New York down to Atlanta, that's the battleground for where the boxes are going in the United States, other than where they stay in the Seattle area or they stay in the LA marketplace. And it's all about the population. Let me show you a couple of these. This is one of 2 of the largest inland ports in Chicago. Pre-development, that's been all developed now. There's buildings all over that, as well as an auto terminal there. But Centerpoint has made an arrangement with both UP and BNSF as a destination for significant amounts of cargo in the Chicago marketplace. This is Alliance in Texas, the Perot project. Perot, for many years, thought that he was going to stand up an international air freight center at his Alliance Park. It turned out that when he made an agreement with BNSF and had them create this destination point off the West Coast in Dallas, that's when his industrial market began to really take off and really began to grow. Today, it's a model of how to do an inland port. Hundreds and thousands of employees there, an entire city now that works and plays and spends and shops all within 5 miles of that facility. In South Dallas, a UP Intermodal yard, and then this new little thing in North Ohio. And you guys in Florida have to scratch your head and say, what difference does a facility like that mean in Northern Ohio to guys in Florida? Well, CSX is going to redesign their entire network around this terminal. Because it is an efficient terminal. It allows them to move significant amounts of goods through there. It allows them to transfer between cities and their origin and destinations. And if they're successful with this model, which I know they already are, you'll see this replicated somewhere down here in the South and the Southeast. Those are my words. That's my guess, not CSX's. So if you talk to your CSX rep, he's going to go, I know nothing, but we believe that's where things are going. I'm going to close up here in just a couple minutes. Real estate markets, where is the growth? Where is the vacancy? Where are the problems? a lot of places with a lot of vacant product, and yet I'm hearing that four-letter word called spec in a couple places. There's a lot of built-to-suit in the Baltimore, Harrisburg, Carlisle area. There's some spec coming out of the ground in the Inland Empire in LA. Several significant build-to-suits in Chicago. And in my backyard in Houston, a lot of new construction is coming out of the ground. A lot of it because of the oil field. And if you look around the country in Ohio, and you look around in West Texas, and you know, chasing the shale and chasing the natural gas. I heard yesterday, I was in Columbus on Tuesday, and they were talking about the implications of the natural gas and the shale and the sands in their market. And there's 9,000 trucks for every hole they drill in the ground have to come and go between that well. So for us in Houston, for Central Ohio and North Dakota, you know, a great deal of opportunity in logistics services, in rail services, as well as development. The growth markets really, though, are you know, the places where there's significant new population and population expansion. We've heard a lot about in-migration. I'm not going to worry on that point. But where there's density, where there's real opportunity. I mean, even Atlanta is starting to show some value, and rents are going up, and there's some build-to-suit going on there. I did add a slide for the Florida markets. Miami clearly is going to be the leader here. And living in San Antonio for many years, I worked in economic development as well as in a 3PL. And our concern was to try to find a way to capture some of the freight that moved through Miami that we knew ended up in Texas. And I became one of many folks over the course of the last 20 years who have tried to sort out a strategy to take a little bit of that sand in the hourglass of Miami away from them. And none of us have been successful. I mean, there's virtually no success. Even in Dallas-Fort Worth, you know, Miami still is the lead in terms of that international airlift coming in and out of Central and South America. It's going to be the strongest of the growth markets here. The health of South America, the air cargo, the 50-foot water depth potentially has some real value to add. This is just a layover of the population growth. And I want to move through to that because I'm looking at my clock, and I want to get to a quick comment about e-commerce. The site selection fundamentals for retail in general are broad and wide. Add into that, if you look about e-commerce, the notion of a surge of labor. So if you look at where Amazon has parked most of their 52 warehouses, they're near a college or near a place where they can pull and adjust their labor. They're in places where they don't have to face the challenge of sales tax. And I can tell you that Amazon, while there's challenges in that market, continues to grow at a faster rate than the traditional retailer. Retail, possibly 3 to 4% growth in this year. But if you look at Amazon's growth, 39% growth over last year, 32 billion. Now that's just a small piece of the total retail. What's interesting to me is the growth in that sector and what it does to the demand for industrial space. 52 distribution centers across the U.S., 17 more in the pipeline, and new ones being added almost every week in key markets. And so you see that group as they grow. Yeah, they have some challenges in terms of their net profit. They have some problems in terms of competing with that last mile. That last mile of delivery for them is going to be a real challenge as they mass up. Can they really be successful in accommodating that? Or will Walmart's business model of delivery to the store and let you pick it up at the store and hope you'll buy some more stuff and go on with it from there? Is that a better model? It's going to be an interesting conversation and interesting to watch as that rolls out. There was a short comment today about this notion of going to a wireless or a paperless or a cashless commerce. I think what we haven't seen yet is the implications of social commerce on retail and e-tail. Facebook, obviously, a lot of noise in the press about their public activity and the amount of advertising they create. They have yet to convert one of those advertising events into a transaction. And when those folks begin to get into the transaction business and become partners in that transaction, not only will they make a hell of a lot of money, but they're going to change the way that commerce is managed, and you'll see them begin to take that advertising and convert it into transactions. Here's the one piece that I want to end up with. This isn't my study. We heard earlier this afternoon that e-commerce and m-commerce and social commerce, when we get to it, is somewhere around 12%. My report shows about 9% of that business is being transacted in non-traditional storefronts. For me, what I look at in terms of distribution and logistics and facilities and labor and warehouse configuration and warehouse demand, and how do you answer the question where I need to be based on the promise I make to my buyer in their pajamas in the middle of the night for how I'm going to deliver the goods back to them in the next 2 or 3 or 4 days. Those things are going to be important items that have to be worked through as we see this growth in e-commerce from what is essentially 9% today to 34% in 5 years, according to the study from the Deloitte folks. Those are really things that affect the locations, that affect the facilities, and they affect where the distribution of goods, all of which I think creates an environment where the challenges of the last 3 or 4 years are going to be just as much fun as the challenges of the next 5 years. And I thank you all very much for your time. And I think I have a minute or two for a question. Or you guys want to go home, I don't blame you. You got a question back there?
Is that on? Yeah.
Yeah, you're on.
A couple of questions. First of all, the state of Florida is pushing very heavily to be more competitive in getting goods coming through the state that are actually meant to be in the state, as opposed to going to Savannah or Charleston and coming back into the state. In a backdrop to that, the Port of Miami has really come to a deal in dredging to the 50-foot depth. There may be some environmentalists working on trying to keeping that from happening, but I'm sure it'll happen. They also obviously dug the tunnel, or digging the tunnel.
Right.
It's going to get trucks off the port quickly, and they've now cut a deal with the FEC to get trains from the port out and up the state as well. And looking at that as a backdrop, we also have Port Jacksonville, or Jacksport, that's got a cost of approaching $600 million or more. I don't know what the number is.
It's a big number.
Dredge to 50 feet. You have Charleston in the same position and Savannah in the same position. Where do you see that all happening? Number one, and number two, we have inland ports that are being conceived of in this state, including Winter Haven, which is obviously very far along, but you have 3 others that are vying for that contention in South Florida, as well as up in Jacksonville, one at I-75 and 10 that's on the books as well. It's a lot to say, but the question is, where is that going?
Yeah, you're right. A lot of questions. Let me answer it with a couple of comments. The first one is that the railroad operators are reluctant to deploy intermodal terminals within 250 miles of each other, because that's something you can cover with a truck. So the first rule is look at where the intermodal activities are and say, if you have one that's coming out of the ground in Winter Haven, draw a circle around that 250 miles. They're not going to put another one inside that circle. End of story. So you're going to get one shot, if you will, at getting the location right for that Central Florida corridor with respect to an inland port or rail destination. Now, the benefit is you have both Norfolk Southern, CSX, and and the FEC that operate here. And what you have to do if you're Miami, or you have to do if you're Jacksonville, or you have to do if you're Tampa, is look at whether or not you can replicate exactly what's going on in Savannah, where they have a dual rail franchise. That's why it's important for you guys to look at the ports and look at the operations. Savannah's strength is its dual rail franchise. Norfolk Southern and CSX both operate literally a 9-iron away from the port terminal. That's one of the reasons why they're as strong as they've been, and they've been as strong as they are, because now if I'm an importer or a BCO or a 3PL, I'm going to use that to my advantage from a rate standpoint to get the best deal that I can to my destination, whether or not it's Florida or Atlanta or Kansas City or wherever it is through there. The question you have about Miami, and I'm not from Florida, and I'm going to get on an airplane and leave tonight, so I'll give you my opinion. You've got the water depth pretty much covered. If you can get the rail capacity to where you don't have to have an intermediate dray between the port and the railroad terminal where you load that box and then it goes inland, then you have a pretty good solution for keeping that freight here rather than allowing it to go to other ports on the East Coast and then being brought back down to you. The problem you also have in Miami is whether or not you're going to be able to support and stand up a balanced inbound and outbound. The air freight guys have lived and died on the strength of having a load of freight that comes in on the freighter and a load of freight ready to go back to the destination. And Miami on the air side has done that eloquently, albeit the fact that they pull from a zone as far away as El Paso and as far away sometimes as Chicago. And if you looked at the distribution of the flowers in the last week that came up here, literally trucks go in every corner of the country. So Miami's challenge with respect to the container is whether or not they can sustain a capture for enough volume to give an ocean carrier with a big ship a reason to go there for both his inbound and his outbound. And I'm going to rest my question there, or rest my answer there. With respect to Jacksonville, the real issue in Jacksonville is, again, about the railroad. The two terminals, Hanjin, and there's another one that's been delayed a couple of times. But both of those are truck served right now. And getting to a point where you have single rail would be great. Having dual rail is probably extraordinarily difficult to get done in Jacksonville. And is it likely that a carrier will run Miami and Jacksonville? Probably not. You're going to get an either or in this context. The reason for that is because the big ships want to make fewer and fewer ports of call. And so they're going to go to the places that have the capacity to discharge not what traditionally is 2,000 or 3,000 containers off a ship, but 4,000 or 5,000 containers, not all of which are going to stay home in that particular market. And therefore they're going to look for that efficiency, because the ships need to be on the water steaming to make the money. Sitting in the port, they don't make them any money. So you're going to see clear A ports and B ports on the east coast of the U.S. in another 10 years. We don't have the money to fund all the dredging and all the infrastructure and all the trains and all the systems to have every port at 50 feet and every port with dual rail serve. We just don't have the funds for that. So somebody at some point in time is going to have to make some decisions, tough ones, about which are the A ports that can pull in the big ships and which are the B ports that have to deal with, the feeder ships that come from Kingston or maybe come from Miami. I mean, that's a pretty good story if you can stop in Miami and you have the capacity to offload and put it on a feeder ship and then feed, the other markets. Good question, tough answer. A lot of moving parts with the railroads, a lot of moving parts with the ocean carriers. And then the BCOs, the 3PLs have a piece of that by trying to figure out where they're going to put their warehouses to support that. That's going to be the place through which they run their freight to support their distribution strategy. One more question?
Steve, can you go into a little more detail on your Gulf port rotation, particularly the advantages to that compared to some of the East Coast ports? Maybe describe some of the ship sizes versus what might go into Miami or Jacksonville.
Yeah, if you look at the 3 or 4 Gulf ports that would be in that rotation, they would be obviously Houston, perhaps Altamira in Mexico, Mobile for sure because of the strength of the automotive industry and the funnel of demand north out of Mobile. And then, you know, I'm ambivalent about which of the East Coast ports or the West Coast ports in Florida get that A list versus the B list. The reality is we're not going to put 8,000 or 10,000 TEU ships in the Gulf because it costs way too much money to dig all those, to do all that dredging. But if you see 5,000 or 6,000 TEU ships that can make a business case for enough volume, balanced inbound to the Gulf and balanced outbound from the Gulf, you need a Florida partner to that rotation. And who that's going to be, I still don't have an answer for. I mean, I have some thoughts about Manatee and I have some thoughts about Tampa, but those things are still being worked out. And we're not going to be ready for 2014, I can tell you that, with a Gulf rotation. Maybe 17 or 18, we might get to a point where we have the legs to do that. Thank you all very much. Enjoyed it. Have a great afternoon.